Call the honourable member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Cowan for articulating what a lot of us on this side of the chamber are feeling, and that is that a bunch of people in our community have become easy targets, really easy targets, because they are the most vulnerable people in our community. And this bill today that I'm speaking on, which we do not support, absolutely targets groups within our community who actually we should be asking ourselves, how do we better support these people, not how do we kick them while they're down. So the two targets in this bill are essentially aged pensioners. You know, on the one hand, you've got a government that says it cares for older people. We're not seeing a lot of action in that, lots of rhetoric, not a lot of action. 10,000 new home care packages is hardly the action that we expect to see for protecting that older cohort. But that's a group that's, we're talking about the same groups of people here, and yet again on two measures here there is an attempt to further punish people for being old and on the pension. And then the second group being targeted here are people on Newstart, youth allowance and other allowances. And again, they are being targeted because of the circumstances in which they find themselves. So let's talk about this bill and what it will do to pensioners. There are the two measures. One is to increase the residency requirements for age and disability pensioners from 10 to 15 years. Now, I looked at this and looked at the numbers involved and thought, this is just mean. This is just something mean that some bean counter thought up that didn't take into account who these people are. So I'll speak in a bit more detail on these. And the second group is age pensioners who travel overseas. So both of these groups are migrant pensioners, people who have chosen to make Australia their home, who deliberately set out to say, we want to be part of Australia. And now that they've been here, they've contributed, they've worked, they are not going to get any of the entitlements that they really should deserve. The bill rips out $185 million from Australian pensioners. The group that I think is so unfairly targeted here are people who have built a life and raised a family here. Not a lot of us in this chamber have made that conscious decision to uproot ourselves and go and live somewhere else. Some have come from migrant families. I've certainly spent 3 years of my life living overseas, and I know the member for Wentworth opposite has spent a considerable amount of time living overseas. But probably, like me, not once did he seriously consider relocating permanently. But these are people who have made that very big choice, and we won't know all the stories behind their reasons for doing that. In the electorate of Macquarie, in my electorate, the group who have done this so effectively, my largest ethnic group, are the Maltese. Now, of course, they've been here many years, and I'm not suggesting that most of those will be affected by the increased residency requirements, but they will be impacted by the stopping of the payment of the age pension supplement when they go home. Now, when you go home to Malta, you don't just pop there for a week or two. You haven't seen family for many years. You've been dislocated from those large families. Now, and it is very common for people to want to go and spend significant amounts of time, a couple of months over there. It might not be with one family member. It's an opportunity to reconnect. These are people who have worked hard. In my electorate, the work they have often done is the hard yards of producing the vegetables that we eat. They are market gardeners originally. They are now on sometimes quite large farming operations in the Hawkesbury. They are the people who really put the fresh food on our tables. And as part of what should continue to be the Sydney Food Bowl, the Hawkesbury is very grateful to the work that the Maltese community have done in ensuring that we do have that produce still thriving. So these are people who have worked hard on the land, and I really don't understand how we can be so mean as to say, sorry, it's just going to cut off after 6 weeks, that extra supplement. You think about the work involved in saving up for this trip in the first place. It isn't something that they can do every couple of years. It is something that is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to go home, see elderly, even more elderly family members. I hope that the government has a change of heart on this and thinks about the human impact. I know that's a big ask. I know it doesn't happen very often with this government. I happen to be an optimistic person and I live in hope. But you really only need to look at the track record of recent years to see how the government's treated pensioners to see that I am probably being way too optimistic. Ever since I watched this government come to office, and I lost the 2013 election, but then watched very closely to see how this government behaved. And in the 2014 budget, we had them trying to cut the pension indexation. The cut that means the pension doesn't increase as it needs to help people cope with the additional costs that they face. Now, that cut would have meant pensioners would have been forced to live on $80 a week less within 10 years. It might not sound like a lot to those opposite, not with their pretty hefty pay packets, but to a pensioner that is a massive amount when the costs of paying your bills keeps going up, particularly energy, which is of course something else that this government has tried very hard to take away from pensioners, energy supplements and just about every concession, everyone who receives some sort of government allowance or concession. Also in the 2014 budget, there was $1 billion cut from those pensioner concessions. There was also the $900 senior supplement cut to self-funded retirees. So, it's sort of like any older person this government's happy to take a whack at if they get some form of government assistance. In the 2014 budget, they also tried to reset deeming rates thresholds, and that's a cut that would have seen 500,000 part pensioners made worse off. And while I'm on deeming rates, it was like drawing blood from a stone to get this government to change the deeming rates. I think there were 5 interest rate falls before the government decided, maybe deeming rates need to be adjusted, and even then the adjustment was pretty minor. These are the sorts of things we've seen. In 2015 was the really big blow. This was the decision by the Greens to do a deal with the Liberals so that the pension was cut to around 3,700 pensioners by as much as $12,000 a year because of a change in the pension assets test. And I have pensioners that are still reeling from that and still trying to find their way and find their footing as a result of those decisions. It didn't stop in 2015. In 2016, we had the first attempt to try and cut the pension to pensioners as part of this plan to limit overseas travel. In the 2016 budget, they also tried to cut the pension for 1.5 million Australians. That was the energy supplement attempt. Now, I think what this shows, we could go on, but it shows a pattern of deliberately targeting people who are least able to find alternate sources of income. They can't just go and sell a wad of shares. They can't just, what they are doing, I have to say, is they've been forced to downsize and to try and find ways to reduce their cost of living. And the reality of that means in summer they don't always use their air conditioners, and in winter they don't always turn on their heating. These are the sorts of challenges that pensioners face right now, even with many of these attempts being able to have been thwarted. I think the other cruel blow is that for 5 years, I think it's 5 years, this government has tried to increase the pension to 70. Increase the pension age to 70. Great if you spend your life sitting on a green bench. Not so great if you're out there working, fixing cars, doing anything physical. Obviously, construction's the obvious one, but nursing, hard yards there. So this is the attitude that we're up against. And I would really urge the government to think closely about the people who are going to be affected here. The other thing that's bolted onto this attack on pensioners is the attempt to extend the waiting period for people who lose their job or are made redundant. Now, let's get really clear. Someone has lost their job or been made redundant. They are now going to be asked to wait another. I think I'm even stunning myself in terms of the length of time. Right now it's 13 weeks. I think that is a long enough period to wait. Any longer than that is really forcing people to dig into the assets that they have. And this liquid assets waiting period, as it is known, is going to have a whole lot of consequences. It isn't just on the person. That person is going to have to dig into their savings for just their normal costs of living. And what if then medical needs arise? What if a car needs repairing? What sort of precarious financial position are these people going to find themselves in? One of the inevitable consequences is that they will turn to shonky payday lenders. They will turn to people who will give them money at exorbitant rates, and this government has failed to tackle that sector at all. And what they're really doing here is driving more customers in the direction of those sorts of shonky loan lenders. That what it's also going to do, and this is the thing that makes me angriest of all, is it's going to make the stress on these individuals and their families even greater. It is already well established that financial stress has mental health consequences for some people. And what we're saying to these people is we're going to make you suffer financially. You're already suffering because you're not working. That not only the financial suffering, but the sense of not having a job. It's not a great feeling. And then we're going to say, and you're just going to have to deal with the consequences of that for your mental health. It is simply cruel. It is mean and cruel to be doing these sorts of things to groups of people who just don't deserve it. And I'd really urge those opposite to go and talk to people in this situation and say, what effect does it really have on you? Might actually be a better question, instead of saying how much harder can we make your life, what can we do to help you move on from where you are? I think the other thing that concerns me about this, for people who've been made redundant and have been given a certain amount of money, the purpose of that is to assist them in retraining often and in working out what direction they want to go in. Yet now we're going to say, look, just rely on it for the basics. There's no extras there. You're just going to have to dig into that. It will force the inquiries that the Senate made into this. Some of the evidence there highlights that it will really force a particular group of people who've been made redundant, and that's middle-aged men in their 50s and 60s. You know, they've worked hard all their life, they've paid taxes, they've been made redundant because perhaps their industry is going through a transition and there's no alternative industry there for them to easily slot into. And what the people who spoke to the senators described was that it will actually force people to go into poverty before they can access any government support. I mean, is that really the intention of this legislation? It's called payment integrity. You know, should it really have in there poverty creation? Is that, I cannot imagine that that is the government's intention, and if these are unintentional consequences, then I'd really urge you to read the dissenting report from the Labor senators around what the real consequences of this legislation are. What we can see is that people will end up, I think this is actually a really good point, that it will be assessed, the money that you have won't just be the cash in the bank. It'll be some of the payments made or that are due to be paid by your last employer. It's obviously the amount of money you've got in the bank, whether you can access that money or not, whether it's on long-term deposit or absolutely available. It might be assets that you've given to a son or a daughter in some circumstances. It might be loans you've made to other people. It might be compensation payments. All of these will be assessed. It is just plain mean-spirited, and it won't just be felt by older Australians and their families. It will flow through to local economies, like my small businesses in the Hawkesbury and Blue Mountains, who really need people to be able to spend a little bit of money on that cup of coffee or that haircut.
I thank the member for Macquarie.